This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition by Janelle K. Hope and Bill V. Mullen. In this landmark book, scholar-activists Hope and Mullen show how generations of black activists and intellectuals, from Ida B. Wells in the fight against lynching to Angela Y. Davis in the struggle against the prison-industrial complex, have stood within a tradition of black anti-fascism. They explore the powerful ideas in activism of figures including Claudia Jones, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Amy Césaire, and organizations including the Civil Rights Congress and the Black Liberation Army. In shining a light on the relationship between fascism and anti-blackness, Hope and Mullen persuasively argue that these writers and organizations developed key tools and strategies for fighting back. Find the Black Anti-Fascist Tradition at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 10th episode of Thawra, The Dig's rolling series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. The first 9 episodes of this series have taken us from the dawn of European imperialism through the British and French colonial mandate governments and the dawn of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. From the birth of Arab nationalism through the Nakba and the struggle for control of post-colonial Syria. From Nasser and Egypt's Free Officers movement to the ensuing region-wide Cold War-entwined fight against the Western imperialist Baghdad Pact and the U.S.'s interventionist Eisenhower Doctrine. An entire set of politics that drove Syria and Egypt into merging as the United Arab Republic in 1958. Finally, the last 2 episodes told 2 key stories about Arab and Palestinian politics throughout the 1950s. First, the early years of the movement of Arab nationalists, a key incubator for the Arab and Palestinian New Left. And then, second, the rise of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement culminating in the foundation of Fatah in 1959. This installment covers another reservoir of mass movement radicalism, centering on Iraq's July Revolution of 1958. Which overthrew the imperialist-aligned Hashemite monarchy and brought Iraqi nationalist and military officer Abdul-Karim Qasim to power. Or, more specifically, brought Qasim alongside a surging Communist Party to power. The July Revolution destabilized Western power in the region and remade the one-time monarchy into an expansive, developmentalist state that attempted to catalyze a more egalitarian turn in Iraq, though definitely not a communist turn. So, meanwhile, the Communist Party, one of the most remarkable communist parties in world history, seemed on the cusp of inaugurating a new anti-imperialist revolutionary process, but with a decidedly non-communist partner in Qasim. Quickly, conflict emerged between different revolutionary currents, including between Qasim and his coup co-conspirator Abdul Salam Arif, as well as acrimony between Baathists and communists. Conflicts that included a major dispute over whether to join the United Arab Republic. The UAR had, just half a year prior, joined Syria and Egypt together into a single superstate under Nasser's rule. Nasser and Qasim, 2 nationalist icons, soon clashed as well. So would Qasim and his increasingly wary supporters among the communists. This moment of intranationalist and intra-left political fighting represented serious political and strategic differences over how to take on the counter-revolutionary triumvirate that still reigned over most of the region. Western imperialism, Zionist settler colonialism, and reactionary Arab monarchies. Yet, they also reflected petty rivalries and bitter feuds that can't be reduced to matters of political principle. In Iraq, The class conflict raged, and it sometimes did so indirectly through the sectarian and ethnic modalities through which class was lived. As so many conflicts mounted, Qasim failed to secure a new formula for revolutionary nationalist hegemony, and so the moment of transformative possibilities would eventually close. Ultimately, as we'll discuss in the next episode, a 1961 military coup would force Syria's secession from the United Arab Republic. And then in 1963, another Syrian military coup, known as the 8th of March Revolution, brought the Ba'ath Party to power there. More coups would come to Baghdad, too. In February 1963, a coup in Iraq led by Nasserites and Baathists overthrew Qasim, a coup that was then followed by yet another coup in November 1963, in which the Nasserites and nationalists purged the Ba'ath and delivered Arif full control. Yet half a decade later, a 1968 coup brought the Ba'ath Party back to power in Iraq, and decisively so. The Ba'ath would preside over an increasingly authoritarian Iraq until the U.S. invasion overthrew Saddam Hussein in 2003. Before we get started, I have two requests for you, my dear listeners. I wrote this intro at 10:46 p.m. after a long day of housing organizing. We truly put everything into this podcast because it means a lot to us. And so please consider two things I oh so humbly ask of you. First of all, please do support this podcast in general and Thawra in particular at patreon.com/thedig. This is a political education project. That's why there's no paywall. We want everyone imaginable possible to listen. And that's only possible because listeners like you contribute. We also have thank you gifts, including our wonderful newsletter sent by email to every single contributor. That's patreon.com/thedig. If you don't believe me about how good the newsletter is, written by the brilliant Ben Mabie, check it out at our website, thedigradio.com. Second, please spread the word about Thawra on social media and in real life. The history that Abed's laying out here is truly one of a kind, and we want this history of Arab radicalism to get out as widely as possible to this incredibly explosive and inspiring anti-imperialist mass movement in solidarity with Palestinian liberation. Along those lines, we're developing a syllabus and study guide to accompany the series so that it can be taught in universities and study groups wherever. We'll soon be reaching out to organizations all over the world to explore partnerships. Stay tuned. Thanks. And here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University, a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. In response to the creation of the United Arab Republic, the Iraqi Hashemite kingdom very briefly in February 1958 united with the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan to create a confederation called the Arab Union, a remarkably short-lived experiment because, as we'll get to in a few minutes, the Iraqi monarchy was overthrown a few months later on July 14th, 1958. Generally speaking, what did the UAR's creation mean for the regional order and the balance of power that defined it? And then I guess also more specifically, what was the significance, or maybe better put, the potential significance of this very brief Arab Union? Did it just embody a conservative reaction, a broader conservative reaction to the UAR?
So the creation of the United Arab Republic put the imperialist forces in the region on the defensive. This was a very bold step that entailed essentially taking Syria firmly out of the potential intrigues around the Baghdad Pact. It meant cementing its neutralist position. It also meant a potential threat to the Israeli settler colonial regime on the long run, because you now had a unified Arab Republic comprising the two most important countries bordering the settler colonialist state of Israel. So And remember, this happened only 10 years after the Nakba. So you had also certain difficulties for the pro-Western allied regimes, particularly Jordan and Iraq, which are the two main countries that had very strong Western presence in them. In Jordan, this Western presence had been now cemented along American lines. It became increasingly taken over by the United States. Previously, Jordan was allied with the British, of course, and it continued to be. But after the nationalization of the Jordanian army, the removal of British officers, and all of the developments that we discussed in previous episodes relating to that, you had an increasing tilt towards the United States in that country. The king of Jordan became, now we can say this now based on documents, actually, it's well documented, became on the payroll of the CIA. So that was a very important place for the Western powers. But also Iraq played an even much bigger role because the Western policy now rested on the idea of counterbalancing Nasser's newly found prestige. He came out of Suez victorious politically. He came out of the attempts to undermine him in the early 50s, also victorious by acquiring weapons from the Soviet Union and its allied states. And also he found alternatives to Western funding for the Aswan High Dam. So now that he had established union with Syria, he was definitely on the ascendance, and Nasserism began to be a prevalent, very potent force in the Arab region. And it had also a very strong media organ, which is, of course, the voice of the Arabs. It had a range of political forces that were allied with it, including, of course, the movement of Arab nationalists, which became a voluntary arm of Nasserism in the region, but also, to some extent, in the early phase of the UAR, of course, the Ba'ath played a key role. So this was definitely a challenge that the Western forces in the region responded to by encouraging moves such as the Arab Union, which was created by Jordan and Iraq. That entailed basically unifying two Hashemite monarchies. In actual reality, there was little concreteness to that union. I mean, there were some Iraqi military divisions that were dispatched to Jordan to strengthen its position. And there were steps of that sort. However, the union never really took a very strong or concrete form.
What did the UAR look like as a government and as a state? How did Nasser set out to rule a country that I think he'd never even set foot in?
Well, I mean, Nasser's outlook when it came to the UAR was that it was always going to be a single state. It was not going to be a federal union. It was going to be a union that depended essentially on incorporating the Syrian government into his own government. And that was going to be a challenging endeavor. I mean, his first challenge was in the army, of course. And Syria, as we have seen in previous episodes, had a succession of governments that depended on military coups. And Nasser was very well aware of that. He was also well aware of the fact that the army was politicized. As we know from previous episodes also, Nasser was opposed to politicization in society as a whole, let alone the military. In particular, political parties. He was opposed to that phenomena. He saw them as a threat to his overall project, which was to create basically a centralized state of a Republican character that would adopt an anti-colonial agenda, adopt a vigorous developmental agenda, basically create a sort of an economic renaissance and a military renaissance of sorts that would enable his country to withstand the pressures of the Cold War period. He did not want alignment with the Soviets. He did not want alignment with the United States. He associated the Muslim Brotherhood primarily with the potential of alignment with the United States and the Western powers. And he associated the Communist Party with the alignment with the Soviet Union. So in many ways, almost his entire political career, at least up till 1967, entailed suppressing these two movements. But that also meant creating a general atmosphere in which political party life was stifled. Now, in Syria, this was always going to be a challenge, and not the least because it was political parties, particularly the Ba'ath, that played a big role in bringing him to power in that country. You had, of course, some initial even communist interest in unity with Egypt, but that quickly declined, especially when the communists realized that their own party was going to have to disband itself under Nasser's new rules. So the communists were the first to oppose the idea of folding their party, and Khalid Bakdash famously announced upon the establishment of the New Republic and the Nasser's directives to the parties that they have to disband, that there had never been a communist party anywhere that had actually disbanded itself. So the communists were to be a problem for Nasser, and later on the Baathists became a problem as well. The communists refused to disband themselves. They wanted closer relations with the Soviet Union. They wanted a whole range of policies that they saw fit with their political program. But the Baathists wanted a greater share in government. And both forces started to feel that the new government was not going to deliver in that regard.
We're moving toward Iraq's July Revolution of 1958, but before we get there, we need to cover some Iraqi history. And a lot of that history that I've been reading about to prep for this interview is from the legendary scholar Hanum Batatu's classic history, The Old Social Classes and the Revolutionary Movements of Iraq, a study of Iraq's old landed and commercial classes and of its communists, Baathists, and free officers. And in that book, Batatu writes, quote, "One must, at least, place the events of July 14th in their natural historic context. From this perspective, they appear as the climax of the struggle of a whole generation of the middle, lower middle, and working classes, the culmination of an underlying, deeply embedded insurrectionary tendency, of which the coup of 1936, the military movement of 1941, the Watba of 1948, the Intifada of 1952, and the risings of 1956 were other manifestations. The free officers were, by visible and invisible threads, and in a very profound manner, caught up in this tendency. And it was in part their realization, as clearly comes out in their talk, that action on the popular level alone could not bring down the old regime, that drove them to seize the initiative." We can't get into a detailed analysis of every twist and turn that brings us to 58, but Abed, lay out the historical and also political economic arc at work in terms of this larger history of Iraqi anti-colonial revolt that the 1958 revolution emerges from.
So basically, Iraq was very important for Western interests, and all of these episodes were outlined by Professor Batatu, the late Professor Batatu, who, of course, wrote, as you mentioned, the classic study on Iraq, and in my opinion, and the opinion of many scholars of the region, the greatest work ever written on any country in the region. So all of these episodes that he is referring to had to do somehow with Iraq's relationship with Britain, with Iraq's place in the world as an independent country, and of course with ultimately with Iraq's control over its own natural resources, its own economy, and its own foreign relations. Britain had such a firm hold over Iraq, and it was able to reestablish its hold in the context of the Second World War, of course, with the suppression of the Rashid Ali Jilani coup, which we had referred to in earlier episodes. That left a sense of bitterness within the Iraqi army on the long run. It also meant that there were many contestations between popular forces and the regime in Iraq, which was a monarchical regime that had been put in power by the British and that had very close relations with them. Now, we've spoken before about the logic that animated the Hashemite monarchies in the region and their overall strategy, which was to work with the imperialists rather than to work against them. And we explained why they believed that this was the best way forward for themselves, but also for the countries that they controlled. That was, of course, a very conservative worldview. It was not shared by the majority of the populace, and in a way, it was undermined even by the official ideology of the Hashemite monarchies. In some sense, they relied on their legitimation on the logic of an Arab nationalism, conservative version of it, a logic that emphasized the Great Arab Revolt against the Ottomans, and the idea that they were establishing regimes that would carry these countries forward on a journey of independence.
After all, the Hashemites are the descendants of the Sharif of Mecca.
Absolutely. And they basically been promoting this ideology, but a conservative variant of it. Amongst the Iraqi political movements, the ranks of Iraqi political movements, from the 1930s onwards, we see the emergence of a communist party that is very powerful in Iraq, and that grows in power. I mean, of course, it goes up and down depending on state repression and other internal factors, internal and external factors. But you have a strong communist movement emerging. You also have other movements. You have a liberal movement represented by different parties in that country, the National Democrats, for example. You have an Arab nationalist movement that takes a more classic right-wing version of it, for the lack of a better term. People like the Independence Party figures. But then you have also a nascent Ba'ath Party that is established from 1949 onwards. And that party initially has humble beginnings, but it grows in numbers and, throughout the 1950s. So that's the political landscape prevailing in Iraq. Now, each of these political movements had its own agendas, but they were all sensitive to the question of the relationship with Britain. They wanted genuine independence for Iraq, and they certainly did not want the continuation of British control over the country, which was associated with figures like Nouri Said and like Abdul Ilah, the regent there. Iraq had a big problem from the late 1930s onwards, which is basically the lack of a strong king. So this, trend meant that you had, therefore, a certain cleavage between the Nouri Said and the regent and the overall outlook of political movements.
I want you to lay out, Abed, a little bit more about the history of the Iraqi Communist Party, because it became a major power, as we'll get into, after the 1958 revolution. What in the decades leading up to that point made the communists such a significant force in Iraq? What sort of communist party was it? How did its leadership and mass membership stitch together various working and middle classes from Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, and before the Nakba, even Jewish Iraq, and those along with other ethnic and religious groups as well? How did the party bring them all together across such a varied geography and a rapidly changing political economic order and class structure?
When we look at the Communist Party, of course, it had started officially in 1934, but it had roots going back to the 1920s. By 1934, there had been an official Communist Party established in Iraq. Now, it went through a phase of major rejuvenation and expansion under the leadership of Fahd, who was the Secretary General from the 1941 period onwards. And basically, the party relied on different sectors of the population. It, of course, like other communist parties, focused on organizing the proletariat or whatever proletarian forces had existed in Iraq. So therefore, it had roots in the trade union movement. It helped contribute to trade union struggles in the country. It had roots, played a major role in expanding the women's movement. And by the way, the women's movement in Iraq was not just some minor phenomena. By the time we get to the early 1950s or to the late 1950s, it had expanded hugely, and there were more than 53 branches of the women's movement that was led by the communists, with thousands and thousands of members. So you had also student ranks join the party. It also had an appeal amongst certain national and religious minorities. You had communist appeal amongst Jewish ranks, as you've mentioned. Of course, not all Jews joined the communist movement. There were many that that belonged to the a more liberal that had adopted a more liberal outlook, or were more connected to trading interests in Baghdad and industrial interests there. But of course, there were others that belonged to other more disadvantaged classes that were attracted to the communist movement and its call. You had also members of national minorities like the Kurds. When the communists were able to attract them because of their internationalist outlook, because of their message of fraternity of peoples. And really, from early on, the Communist Party had represented a sort of idea of fraternal unity between the Arab and Kurdish peoples in Iraq, and had advocated very early on national rights for the Kurdish population. So in many ways, the party had appeal within areas that had really suffered from the agrarian challenges in Iraq, from the landowners. The fact that there was concentration of land ownership in the country was a big issue, and these are the structural factors that helped give the party a broad and diverse social base. Now, at different points, this base manifested itself in different ways. The balance of power within the party reflected different elements coming from these different social classes and different ethnic and religious groups. But there's no doubt that the party could mobilize along a very broad base across the country. From the north, which was predominantly Kurdish, to the south, which was predominantly Shia. I mean, here I should note, by the way, that we should be careful with just referring to phenomena in Iraq along national or sectarian lines. Later on, after the American occupation, these become cemented and they become ossified in a way, these identities. They were more open in earlier periods and more fluid. But nevertheless, of course, they reflect part of the sociological reality in the country, and they should not be overlooked in any discussion. And that's the nice thing about studies like Hanna Batatu's, is that they account for the class dimension as well as these ethnic and religious dimensions that we refer to.
Obviously, communist parties are a force throughout the region, but why is the Iraqi Communist Party so powerful compared to other Arab countries? And what was it about the party's method of organization, its approach to the national and social questions, that allowed it to revive itself to the point that it was at on the eve of the revolution after having experienced so much brutal repression?
When you look at the class composition in Iraq, we see that there's a growth in the working class and in the proletarian sections of the working class, especially because it's a country with a major oil industry. So you have there Iraqi Petroleum Company, which is a consortium of British and American companies, but also the British government has a share in it. That's an area where you have to have workers operating in the fields. There's a railway sector operating in Iraq. There are major infrastructural projects that are being built. So it's a country that has all of these resources and this expanding sector that allows for the emergence of an industrial working class base. It's also a country that's undergoing a major urbanization in this period. And that urbanization is complemented with major pressures on the peasantry in the countryside, especially because of the high levels of concentration of land ownership. So when you have this coincidence of massive injustice in the countryside, considerable expansion of industry and urbanization, it's only natural that the communist call would find some following. But also you have the national and ethnic questions that we've referred to earlier, in addition to a very strong history of contestation with imperialism. This was a country, remember, that the British Empire had invested a lot of resources and commitments towards controlling. And the history of Iraq, in a way, the history of the popular movements in Iraq coincides with this contestation with empire on the one hand, and then with the class interests that had been produced under the rule of the empire. That's an important thing to think about. Now, for the communists, I'll give you an illustration of how this works. One of the main things that the communists were able to do in the 1940s was to actually organize the oil workers and the railway workers. And throughout this period, you had major strikes taking place. Between 1945 and 1947, for example, you had a huge amount of strikes. And then you had the Wathba in 1948, which led basically to a coalescence between economic demands, but also around political demands relating to the Anglo-Iraqi Defense Treaty, the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty, which still tied Iraq to British rule. So the communists were, of course, officially opposed to empire, but also they held the banner of class struggle. So their appeal was quite considerable in those years. Now, although their appeal is considerable, of course, they're the political force that was combated the most in many ways by the regime and by the British. And that especially becomes the case, with the end of the Second World War. Initially, during the early years of after 41, during the years of the Second World War, the communists support the Allies clearly because of the Soviet position amongst the Allies and because of their opposition to Nazism and fascism. But as soon as the war ends, it's only natural that they're going to clash with the regime. And a very heavy-handed policy is adopted towards them. Many of their cadres are in prison. Many of them are arrested. They, in many ways, pioneer many of the methods of clandestine struggle that become staple in Iraq, but also across the Arab world as a result of the fact that they have to deal with these structural pressures on them.
As you referenced earlier, one group in Iraqi society that we should discuss more before getting to the revolution are the Kurds, whose aspirations for national self-determination in Kurdistan play a key role throughout modern Iraqi history, definitely through the present day. And Abid, I want you to give listeners some key context for the discussions that will follow periodically throughout the final episodes of this series. How does the Kurdish movement in Iraq, which has witnessed repeated rounds of armed struggle from various Kurdish factions, how does it first emerge under British colonialism and the monarchy? And where does Kurdish national politics in these years leading up to 1958, how does it fit into or relate to an Iraqi Communist Party that, as you mentioned, is frequently throughout its history substantially Kurdish? And lastly, how do Kurdish politics in Iraq throughout this period compare and relate to what's taking shape elsewhere in Kurdistan, in Iran, Syria, and Turkey? Kurdish national politics take a lot of different directions after 1958, and we'll get into a bunch of that later on. But before we get there, lay out that context.
So one thing that is important to note is the structural dynamic here. So at the end of the First World War, and this is really, we always have to go back to the end of the First World War if we want to understand this region. The peace settlement that took place did not entail the emergence of a Kurdish state. It created a regional map in which you had a Turkish state appearing. And of course, that Turkish state came out as a result of a strong and major war for independence that was carried out by a Turkish nationalist figure, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But his outlook was of a chauvinist kind when it came to national minority questions. So, of course, it had very little space for Armenians, but also it had very little space for Kurds. Kurds, as far as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk were concerned, were what he called mountain Turks. So this denial of a particularity or of a national particularity led eventually to a long history of contestation with the Turkish state, of course, and that continues to this very day. You have a dynamic in, of course, Iran. There are Kurdish regions as well in the northwest of the country, where the situation is slightly different and history is very different because Kurds relationship to the central authority there is more complicated. They're better integrated to it in some ways, but also there develops a national movement in Kurdish areas there, and that does sometimes lead to armed clashes with the Iranian government. You have a dynamic in Iraq where the Kurdish areas get absorbed into the modern Iraqi state, which is predominantly an Arab state. And the British project there was to establish eventually an Arab dynasty there. So the British had merged essentially the Kurdish areas with the Arab areas, producing modern day Iraq as we know it. In Syria, there's a smaller Kurdish population than in these other countries, but of course, and it's a slightly different situation when it comes to territorial contiguity of Kurdish areas, because what you have there is essentially Kurdish cantons that are separated by areas that are very intermixed and ethnically diverse. But again, like there you have predominantly Arab state when it comes to the ethnic makeup of it. Now, this means that there is always a latent potential for the emergence of Kurdish nationalism after the end of the Ottoman Empire. The old Ottoman arrangement did not, of course, emphasize ethnic nationalism, as we've discussed earlier, because that would have been anathema to the logic of the empire itself, which was a multi-ethnic empire. And there were broader identities into which people could be absorbed. Primarily an Islamic one for Kurds and Arabs, that Kurds and Arabs could be absorbed into, because Kurds are predominantly Muslim, of course, and so are the Arabs. The majority are Muslim. However, once you start establishing nation states in the region, and you don't have a Kurdish nation state established on the regional map, there was going to be a contradiction between the Kurdish leaderships and the central authorities. That's the broader kind of context. Now, Kurdish nationalism is a fairly late comer into the nationalist game. Initially, you have Turkish nationalism in the case of the Ottoman Empire. It comes first, and then you have Arab nationalism. And then you end up with Kurdish nationalism a bit later. But there was very early on a rejection of the idea that Kurds will not have their own state in the case of Iraq. So Kurds, of course, launched rebellions against the British-imposed map very early on, as soon as the modern state of Iraq is established. These get suppressed. You have a period of ebbs and flows, essentially, when it comes to the relationship with central authorities. The strongest leadership of Kurds in the early years of the post-World War I period was concentrated in feudal sections of the Kurdish population. These were strong figures belonging to land-owning families and chiefdoms. Kurdish society, in the case of Iraq, was very much organized along tribal lines, but also it had strong class cleavages within it. You had landowners and you had peasants. So you had the development of traditional leaderships, and many of them continue to persist to this very day. They use a mix of tribalism, but also in earlier periods, there were Sufi movements as well, different tariqas that galvanized people around them politically. But at the end of the day, the major figures that led these movements belonged to the privileged land-owning and tribal chieftain classes. And a classic example in the case of Iraq is, of course, the Barzani family. But then you also have, under the communists, a new way of organizing Kurds. And that way of organizing Kurds depends on a class-based logic that attracts people who do not belong to the upper classes, but also it attracts the new young intellectuals that start appearing in Kurdish areas. Students that had studied in Baghdad. Remember, one sociological feature that's very important, Daniel, to note here is that for the most part, the Kurdish population was not an urban population originally. Even in big cities like, let's say, Erbil. Erbil was originally a Turkish city. It was mainly Turkmens that had inhabited it. But over the years, it got Kurds got to urbanize in it and became part, the majority population there. And that's the current status of that city. Kirkuk is another good example. It was always historically a Turkmen city. Now, by the way, these statements will not appeal to Kurdish nationalists today. They're not going to like hearing them, but that's the historical truth. It's the urban population in these cities was a Turkmen population, which is a feature of the diversity of Iraq's ethnic makeup. But Kirkuk starts attracting Kurdish working class people because they're working in the oil fields there, and the city starts expanding as a major oil city because that's one of the richest oil fields in the world. And of course, the IPC conducts many of its operations there. So we have these sociological changes taking place. And of course, that allows for openings for the communist movement. The communist movement also allows young intellectuals from Kurdish backgrounds to be exposed to new ideas, to be exposed to new ways of thinking about liberation and emancipation. And therefore it gains momentum in those circles. Now, you also have a weird situation going on where the old traditional leaderships find themselves in a situation where they have to express their own political programs through political parties, and that leads to the emergence of the KDP, for example.
The Kurdish Democratic Party.
Yes, which, of course, initially the Barzanis play a big role, and they continue, to play a big role in it. But they very much, they're mixing the feudal and the tribal with the national in a party like that. So that party somehow attracts also young intellectuals, attracts others from different backgrounds, including later on the big competitor of the Barzanis, Jalal Talibani, who later on establishes his own faction in the Kurdish movement in Iraq.
And who will also play a role in our discussion of the Palestinian Revolution, or make a cameo appearance.
Absolutely.
So just to circle back to something that we keep touching on, just how substantial was the Kurdish presence, both in terms of the base and leadership of the Iraqi Communist Party, and how and when did that presence and power come about?
So, Daniel, to answer that question, we need to think about the repression of the state, but also the context of the late 1940s. So we have the Wathba that we referred to, which was a major popular uprising that took place, but that was heavily suppressed and that the government blamed the communists for in many ways. And they even executed the great figure of the party that had really turned it into major force, Fahd, in the wake of this. That was a big blow to the communists. The other blow came as a result of their acceptance of the Soviet line around the partition resolution of Palestine. Initially, there was strong opposition to partition, including amongst Jewish communist members of the party, which were not an insubstantial group and that were very prominent in its intellectual wing. And they had formed organizations that were opposed to Zionism. They formed a league against Zionism, in fact. But they all had to basically adopt the Soviet line, led also to a decline, or the party took a hit in 1947-48 as a result of that. So this combination of state repression and the broader geopolitical context led to a crisis within the party. And the party, what compensated for the losses in areas, in essentially predominantly Arab areas of the country, was the party's gaining of strength in the Kurdish areas. So you have a period of Kurdish ascendancy from 49 till roughly the mid 50s, in which you have a preponderance of Kurdish leaderships in the party. By the time we hit the challenges against the Baghdad Pact and the new developments that happened in the 1950s, the party becoming closer to Arab nationalism in some ways. So it was saying that it had reformulated its policy, saying, look, we're not against Arab unity, we're not against Arab nationalism, but we're calling for a non-chauvinist nationalism, a nationalism built on the fraternity of Arab and Kurdish peoples. So that takes place as the Soviet Union forms better relationships with Nasser, as the Soviet Union reformulates its overall policy towards Arab nationalism. You see something similar happening on the ground with the communists. This expansion in the Arab areas then returns the balance to an earlier phase, where you still have Kurdish members, of course, but they had suffered from state repression, but also you have an expansion in a newfound Arab base because of the adjustment to the new geopolitical realities that were emerging.
It's the communists' increasing embrace of Arab nationalism and leadership in terms of mobilizing anti-imperialist struggle across the region during the 1950s, as we've been discussing for episodes.
Correct. In many ways, 1950s is the peak of the communist success in the region. Between the mid 1950s to the early 60s, that's like, especially the mid 1950s, that's a period of great achievement for the communists.
Let's lay out how the July Revolution took place, and we inevitably can't do that in all the detail we'd like to because there's so many moving pieces. There was a civilian component. There were the Baathists, communists, various nationalist civilian forces that began to work together, and in February 1957, they form a Front of National Union, and this is all amidst these upheavals over the Baghdad Pact and the Suez aggression, the rise of neutralism, the turn toward the USSR all across the region. But this civilian opposition was initially in the dark with regards to what was brewing in the army, which was that a free officers movement, taking inspiration from the Egyptian free officers movement that had orchestrated the 1952 coup in Egypt. There was one in the works in Iraq, and it was neither communist nor Baathist. How did the free officers pull off this coup against the Hashemite monarchy and the government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Said? What was the relationship between the free officers' coup and the civilian mass mobilization? And how was it that Abdul-Karim Qasim and Abdul Salam Arif became the paramount coup leaders, given that they had not been core members of the long-standing free officers conspiracy?
The army in Iraq cannot be seen in isolation of the social forces existing in the country. Because it was an army that drew in large part on conscription, but also on people that came from the lower classes. I mean, you had to be in the lower end of the middle class or even belonging to the working class to become part of the army, because the upper classes in general tended to shy away from military service. And that's a pattern that we see, in many different countries of the world, of course. Iraq always relied on military officers that came from that kind of social base. Now, many of them, of course, had certain ethnic or religious features. A lot of them were Sunni Arab officers, in particular, that tended to be a major recruitment base for the officer class. But you also had people with diverse backgrounds, including Abdul-Karim Qasim himself, who had an Arab Sunni father, but he had a Kurdish Shia mother. So you had this composition of the army that reflected basically class interests that were quite different to those in power. Now, in general, the monarchical regime focused on buying the loyalty of the class of army officers that had, certainly those that had higher ranks. So it offered better pay than many local armies surrounding them, and it tried to give them advantages. However, they were always connected to political life in the country and to different political currents that had existed there. This meant that they were also affected by the regional and geopolitical contestations that were going on in the region. For the most part, these people were patriots in the army. They did not like the idea of subordination to the British Empire, and that meant that they had a contradiction when it comes to their political outlook and the actual role they served. Their job was to protect a government that was essentially closely tied to the British, and that caused a long-term sense of dissonance in a way. The developments in the region in the 1950s added to that dissonance in substantial ways. So after the 1952 coup in Egypt, which of course then developed into a revolutionary set of changes, you had people being inspired by the idea of overthrowing the monarchical system and instituting a more patriotic policy, and you had this idea that the army could play a role in that. And here we're talking of figures that were not members of particular political parties. The person that comes up with the idea of Iraqi free officers is a man called Rifat al-Hajj, who was a patriot, but was not necessarily ideological in any clear way. He starts the initial mobilization for the creation of a free officers movement there. Over the years, the movement picks up steam, in the post-1952 period. Different officers join it. Eventually, though, by 1957, you have two particular officers joining the movement that were to play a key role in the history of Iraq later on, which were the initial leader of the revolutionary period, post-58, which is Abdul-Karim Qasim, but also Abdel Arif, who plays a key role in the actual carrying out of the coup or the revolutionary coup that took place in 1958.
And later becomes the leader.
And later becomes a leader. Of course, there's tension and Abdul-Karim Qasim that eventually leads to a clash. So we have here a situation where the military in many ways represented a kind of mosaic, a political mosaic. There were people that had affinities with the communists, people that were attracted by Arab nationalist ideas. You had people that were independent, but they were patriotic. However, all of these different figures were not happy with the British arrangement in the country and with British control over the country. And all of them were especially coalescing against the idea, around the idea of confronting that arrangement as a result of regional changes, particularly after Suez. Throughout in 1956, when you have all of these regional changes happening, and especially once a tripartite aggression takes place, there's real disgruntlement in the Iraqi military over Iraq's role in this arrangement. The Iraqi military is also sensitive to its role in the role of its government in the Baghdad Pact. It had clearly picked an aligned side with the West. It was seen as collaborating with imperialist powers, which in general added to this dissonance that we're talking about. Iraq was not yet a fully independent country as far as these officers were concerned, because it was still orbiting around this. The West had not found a formula for breaking away from this Western control. And at a time when Egypt was being attacked in such a heavy way in 56, that caused a serious crisis. Now, how was the crisis going to be resolved was a question that not only depended on the military, but also on what's going on in the civilian politics. And here, your reference to this united front that had emerged, this national front that had taken shape, that brought together different forces that differed in their ideologies, but that were all united in their anti-imperialism. That was very important politically, because it meant that the country had a political atmosphere that was amenable for change. The National Democrats did not want the continuation of this arrangement with the British. Certainly not after 56. Same goes for the communists, same goes for the Baathists, and same goes for the Istiqlalis and other traditional Arab nationalist forces in the country. So that means that you have an atmosphere that's ripe for change in the country.
Was Iraq's July Revolution an actual revolution, or was it more like a coup, as it had been with the free officers in Egypt? Did the sort of mass popular mobilization that took place in Iraq alongside the free officers coup, did that make what took place in Iraq different?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, there's a big debate on whether the coup in Egypt was a revolution or not. I mean, we've talked about that. In many ways, I view it as a beginning of a revolutionary process in the case of Egypt. But in the case of Iraq, there's greater popular participation in the events of 1958. So you have about 100,000 people that went out in demonstrations in the street as soon as word reached the masses about what's going on with the army taking power. So initially, if you want to think about it, what the army move took the form of a coup. You had basically 3 divisions, each of them numbering no more than 1,000 people, entering into the capital and essentially taking over the royal palace and other key areas in the capital. But soon you have big demonstrations that go on. And many of these are led actually by the Communist Party. And this is a significant thing to bear in mind, because the communists show that they can actually put people on the street. They can actually produce action. There were others, of course, that were not communists, Many people went out in the street at the time, but there was popular participation in a way of that sort, and there was certainly popular enthusiasm for the overthrow of the monarchy that took place at the time. So this meant that you had essentially features of a revolutionary mobilization that coalesced around the military move that took place. That's how Hannah Batatu analyzes it. I agree with his analysis. Others disagree. Others will tell you, without a coup, nothing would have happened. Therefore, let's just call it a coup. In general, Western officials tended to downplay the nature of this as a revolution. But more radical historians tend to emphasize its revolutionary character because they talk about the fact that the changes in the army reflected broader sociological changes and reflected a kind of a wave of events and an accumulation of processes that were of a revolutionary nature that affected the army itself.
Hashemite Iraq, as we've discussed with some frequency in prior episodes, it was a major force for Western imperialism in the region. In other words, it was not a coincidence that the Baghdad military alliance was called the Baghdad Pact. So what were the July Revolution's consequences for a regional balance of power at a time that this balance of power was the product of all these intense conflicts over the Baghdad Pact, the Syria crisis, the Eisenhower Doctrine? At the time, U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles said, quote, "If the Iraqi coup succeeds, it seems almost inevitable that it will set up a chain reaction which will doom the pro-Western governments of Lebanon, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia and raise grave problems for Turkey and Iran." What did the Iraqi Revolution mean for the regional order and for Western imperialist power within it?
So here, Daniel, we have to look at what are the Western interests in Iraq. First of all, Iraq's major oil reserves is a big issue for the Western countries. And as I mentioned earlier, you have the Iraq Petroleum Company. But also the role that that company plays, besides the fact that it's Western-owned predominantly, is that it also ensures the sustenance of the main basis of prosperity for the West in the 1950s. If you think about it in global terms, there's reconstruction happening post-Second World War across Europe, and there's this economic boom that's going on, but that's fueled by very low energy prices, which is done in an artificial way by suppressing prices in places like Iraq. Because those countries like Iraq do not control oil prices, they're subject to these foreign companies. They have to basically export this good at a very low price, and that's a major interest for the West economically.
This is the entire Western post-war political, economic, and social order we're talking about here.
Absolutely. And in many ways, we start seeing challenges to this order, initially actually not from this region at all. It comes from Venezuela. You have the big oil fights that happen in the late 40s in Venezuela. In a way, they start signaling what could happen in other spaces. Big fear is nationalization, of course. So Iraq plays a big role in keeping the oil prices down. At the same time, it plays a very important geopolitical role because this is an Arab country that is seen as a counterbalance to Egypt. Egypt is the largest Arab country in terms of population. In the Arab East, the next country in terms of population at the time was Iraq. And of course, in terms of its cultural importance, in terms of its weight overall in Arab political and cultural life, Iraq has a second place essentially in this region after Egypt. So it's vital for the West to have this country being in their flying in their orbit. Now, it's also a country that neighbors Turkey, that neighbors Iran, that neighbors Kuwait, that neighbors Saudi Arabia, and neighbors Jordan, and neighbors Syria. It's so important geopolitically in that regard. So for the West, this was a major shock, having like a revolution like this taking place. It's a major shock, not the least because the revolution initially was supported by the United Arab Republic. It meant potentially bringing Iraq closer to Nasserism. Now, that did not happen, as we'll explain in a second. But initially there was that potential, and certainly Nasser gave the revolution political cover in its initial moments, and had even promised officers, Iraqi free officers, that he would support any action that they would take against the government in that stage. His media played a big role in creating a popular atmosphere that was favorable to the revolution. Sawt al-Arab, the voice of the Arabs radio from Cairo, had exposed the imperial commitments and ties that connected the Iraqi government with Britain and the United States. So again, this was a major threat to the Western powers to have this kind of geopolitical new reality taking place.
So for the international oil majors, the Western corporations that control basically, the vast majority of the global oil economy at this point, which in Iraq is the Iraqi Petroleum Company. It's a consortium controlled by Western oil majors. What exactly is the condition that they're trying to maintain in the market?
So, Daniel, the main imperial interest in the case of Iraq was to ensure that there would continue to be the flow of cheap oil, of course, which is a global necessity that fuels the post-Second World War economic order. There's places like Europe, they had to do reconstruction. You had major industrial production taking place. So you needed cheap oil to fuel that. And Iraq, of course, plays a key role in that. But at the same time, the Western governments wanted to ensure that the interests they're beholden to, the capitalist interests they're beholden to, including the oil companies, which are very powerful in places like London and Washington, are also satisfied. So in a way, you needed to suppress Iraqi oil production to some extent to connect with the realities of overproduction in the 1950s, but at the same time, make sure that countries like Iraq do not have any impact on prices through, for example, nationalizing oil companies. So keeping the oil companies in charge, the Western oil companies in charge, was essential, but also suppressing production in places like Iraq so that the overproduction that was taking place does not drive prices too low for the profitability of oil companies. So that was the balance that the Western powers were trying to maintain. And of course, that's to the disadvantage of countries like Iraq, which were major oil producing countries, because their interest is to actually achieve the right price for them to be able to gain the profits they need. In a way, there's a contradiction there because the producer is essentially, in this case, controlled by the consumer being the main imperialist powers. They want the right price for them. But the producer also is not gaining the bulk of the profit, because the bulk of the profit is going to the companies of the consumer, which were the imperialist companies, the oil companies that were close to the imperial governments in the US and the UK.
I highly recommend that listeners who want to know more about this check out my 2-part interview with Giuliano Garavini on OPEC and the struggle to sort of decolonize the global oil system.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication. You've probably seen a lot of what they've published online, but they also have a beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin. After the coup, Qasim quickly began to sideline his coup d'etat co-conspirator Aref, and so Qasim quickly became the unrivaled top leader of the revolutionary government. And really critically, this is something that the communists, who were getting closer and closer to Qasim, that they actively encouraged and emphasized. How did this relationship between the communists and Qasim take shape in the early post-revolutionary months, each successfully working with the other to elevate themselves above their rivals?
So let's start by emphasizing that Qasim was not a communist. However, he saw an importance for his relationship with the communists, and the communists, of course, placed a great deal of importance on promoting him. In many ways, it's the communists that play the key role in promoting Qasim as the sole leader.
They would march around with a chant being like, Qasim is the sole leader, or something like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. This notion that Qasim is the sole leader is very much promoted by them. But the question that we should ask is why? So when we look at the initial weeks after the revolution, the main demand that is coming from Arif, but also from many others, is for immediate unity with the United Arab Republic, Iraq to join the United Arab Republic. And that's a demand is made by the Baathists. It's encouraged actually by the founder of the Baath Party, Michel Aflaq, who is, of course, Syrian, but who comes to Iraq right after the revolution to promote this idea.
And the Baathists hitch themselves to Aref. So there's this kind of parallel thing going on with the communists allying with Qasim, who opposes unification with the UAR, and the Baathists hitching themselves to Aref, who supports unification.
Yes, so you have this complicated situation going on. Different political movements have to attach themselves to different leaders within the army at this stage. But also, I should note that there are differences within the Baath itself. Rakabi, who was the head of the party in Iraq at the time, was not necessarily pushing for an immediate unity, but then he's put in a difficult position when the founder of the party, Michel Aflaq, shows up in town, comes from Syria, and is suddenly pushing big time this idea. Remember, the Baath Party at this stage is not the biggest party. The communists are much bigger. They have a few hundred members, and they have a few thousand fellow travelers, but they're not the biggest political force. And they have to be careful in the events that take place. However, the Baathists do, in general, of course, eventually, are all committed to the idea of let's join the UAR. The communists, on the other hand, although they were happy initially with supporting, just before the revolution, they were calling for a federal union with the UAR. Right after the revolution, they recalibrate their position. This is partly to do with the policy of the UAR towards the Syrian communists. Khalid Bakdash, who was the head of the Syrian communists, clashes with Nasser and clashes with the idea of the UAR by refusing to dissolve the party and by basically promoting a political program that seemed to be undermining Nasser's authority in Syria, which leads Nasser then to crack down on his party and to arrest many of its members. This crackdown on the Syrian communists affects the Iraqi communists. But you have this situation that's very strange, Daniel, where political contingency and different changes in different areas of the region affects the politics of each state. And the end result was tragic, because what you have then is the start of an process that had a snowballing effect when it came on to the relationship between the communists and the nationalists across the region. But it starts in Iraq.
It starts in Iraq, but is fundamentally caught up with the Iraq relationship with Nasser in the UAR. And so these domestic conflicts within Iraq and within the UAR are fundamentally inseparable from conflicts between the UAR and Iraq.
Right. So the UAR's relationship between its two different areas, what they call the northern region, which is Syria, and the southern region, which is Egypt. So, and the decisions of the Egyptian government in relation to the communists in the northern region. And of course, it has to do with Khalid Bakdash himself and his own decisions to regionalize his struggle with Nasser, the struggle of Syrian communists with Nasser. So he's encouraging also. He has, by the way, a lot of weight in the communist movement in the Arab world, not the least because of his strong relationship with the Soviets. In many ways, he's the leader that they have the closest relationship with, that continues for many years. So you have this very complicated dynamic going on. And that means that the communists in Iraq are not enthusiastic about immediate union. The other thing that's happening is that they're worried that they would lose their political weight. And that now was a moment when, they're the biggest ideological party in the Iraqi scene. If the Iraq joins the UAR, they would not be the biggest party in a country that bans all parties. And there's also others, some scholars also emphasize the sectarian dimension. They say that, look, Iraq is a country that has a lot of Shia in it. The Shia are a strong social base for the Communist Party. Therefore, they're less enthusiastic about a situation where they would be absorbed into a bigger Arab Sunni country. I'm less inclined to overemphasize this at this stage, because actually, if you look at the run-up to this period, from 56 onwards, there's a great deal of popularity for Nasser in Shia districts. So, the two main Ba'athist leaders are Shia, for example, that are calling for union. So can't just be reduced to sectarian factors at this stage. There is an actual political dimension going on. Nevertheless, you can't completely discount some element of sectarian outlook in certain circles. But I would caution against overemphasizing it in those dynamics. So now this communist hesitance around joining the UAR is basically coincides with the hesitance that is shown by Abdul-Karim Qasim himself, who basically initially in the initial period after the revolution is ambiguous on these questions, but increasingly it becomes clear that he sees a separate trajectory for Iraq, and he sees himself as basically building a new national project in Iraq. That's why people sometimes identify him as some sort of Iraqi nationalist figure. He sees himself as the father of a newly reconstituted nation. And in some ways, again, this is somebody who represents all the major ethnic and religious groups in the country by virtue of his background. He also represents a certain middling position when it comes to the social conflicts taking place in the country. So he belongs to a lower middle class family. He sees himself as a champion of the working classes and the poor peasantry, while at the same time not being opposed to capital in its entirety. So you have these ingredients that coalesce to create a certain outlook that drives his conception of his role. And he certainly does not want to come under the power of Nasser or any other figure. He wants to lead in many ways. I should note, like Nasser, Qasim is an incorruptible figure. That's what's interesting, is that they're both not very much interested in financial gain. They both left life with very little property or money, but they were very much men who had a clear sense, and almost a providential sense of their role in life. They had this notion that they had a certain destiny in the service of their peoples. So that kind of character gets extinct after the death of these two men.
By late 1958 and into 1959, the revolutionary tensions begin to unravel into outright, intense conflict between increasingly hostile revolutionary factions. And I want to lay out a year-plus long arc that has so many twists and turns, and we're going to have to keep it at a certain level of abstraction. But let me recap and correct me if I get a detail wrong. Aref was charged with trying to assassinate Qasim. He was tried and sentenced to death, and then his death sentence is commuted. Nationalists quit Qasim's cabinet in protest. There's an attempted military uprising in Mosul in March 1959, backed by Nasser's United Arab Republic. The uprising's put down, but there's widespread violence and brutality that has both class and sectarian qualities. And then in the wake of that, Qasim consolidates power as his communist allies sought and received a growing share of power themselves, including armed police power for communist militias on the streets. Then violence erupted in July 1959 in Kirkuk, with communist-aligned Kurds attacking Turkmen, referring back to something we were discussing at the top of the episode. This is a very mixed city in Kirkuk. Violence, again, that has political, sectarian, and class dimensions. And then finally, in October 1959, Ba'ath Party assassins, including a young Saddam Hussein, attempted to kill Qasim but only managed to wound him. And it was at this point, says Batatu, that Qasim really began turning the regime into a personal dictatorship. And so after elevating the communists for so long, Qasim then began to check and reduce communist power, ultimately really aggressively attacking them. What should listeners take away, Abid, from this intense series of intertwined and escalating conflicts?
If we want to think of it structurally, you have a situation after the revolution in which there were multiple ideologies, multiple social interests, and multiple ethnic and sectarian interests operating in this one space called Iraq. And of course, you had severe geopolitical pressures intervening, both on the global level and on the regional level. And that meant that somebody like Qasim had to find a social base that could support him, but at the same time had to be careful not to basically be under the control of that social base. And by that, I mean social base as mediated by a political party as well, in this case, because he does not have a party. Remember, in a way, none of these officers really have a party. They don't form a party. And unlike the Egyptian Free Officers movement, they do not cohere into a very basically disciplined revolutionary governing body that is controlled by a single strong figure. That's what Nasser does in Egypt. He's able to essentially create a revolutionary command in which he's the number one figure. Now, of course, he always has to make concessions to other officers, and he does, sometimes to the disastrous effect. But essentially, they find a way for allocating power and for dividing the distribution of power. In Iraq, that does not happen. Immediately, they're confronted with a big challenge. What is to be done with the UAR? Immediately, Arif takes a position that's very different than Qasim's, and they clash. Arif, finds a connection with the Baathists, and because of the identity of their interests in supporting this union. But Qasim makes a set of moves against him that ensure that he's marginalized and that he's unable to completely operate within the military in a way that would undermine Qasim's power. At the same time, you have a situation where you have a plurality of political forces operating. None of them can achieve complete paramountcy, but one of them is particularly strong in terms of its ability to mobilize. And that's, in this case, the communists. So they're mobilizing, and they decide to mobilize in support of Qasim. Qasim does not want to only rely on them. He does a couple of moves to try to diversify his base. He wants to be able to represent different segments. Relying on the communists would have meant that eventually, for example, he would need to completely go down the Soviet path. Relying with the communists would mean alienating figures from the national bourgeoisie that he was keen to maintaining connections with. People like Muhammad Hadid, who was an industrialist and who was a finance minister, and who was very close to Qasim. Qasim is trying to achieve good relations with the Soviet Union without losing his connection with the West. He wants to do some reforms locally that benefit the working classes and the peasantry. So he does important land reforms. He does important taxation reforms. He increases the taxes on the wealthiest segments of society. But at the same, and of course, his biggest move eventually, and that's really possibly the move he was really aiming towards, is his nationalization of a good chunk of the IPC, the Iraqi Petroleum Company, because in a country like Iraq, that is the most important resource. So he has his own ambitious program, but when it comes to social reform and economic reform, but it is not a revolutionary program along communist lines. That means that he has to diversify his base. That's why, for example, he brings back Mustafa Barzani, who was the head of a major Kurdish uprising. He had participated in an effort in Iran in the 1940s called the Republic of Mahabad. And he comes back from exile, brought in by Abdul-Karim Qasim. That's partly to ensure that he has a social base that could help him contain the Arab nationalist pressure on him to unify with Egypt, while at the same time having a group other than the communists to balance them out in his support. So he's playing a constant balancing game. He does not want to completely cut his ties with the nationalists either, because he wants to make sure that the communists do not become the sole force in the country. But that also creates problems for him with the communists. And later on, he pays the price for not completely destroying the nationalists, because at the end of the day, the only faction that stays loyal to him to the very end, despite the fact that he cracked down on them, was the communists.
I just want to emphasize that by 1960, Qasim goes so far as to support essentially a fake communist party taking the legal place of the real communist party. There's suppression of communist press, communists removed from high government posts, communist mass organizations suppressed, communists driven from union leadership. It gets very bad.
Yes, I mean, it gets very bad, but that's also partly a result of the communists maybe overplaying their hand in some ways. And in the previous period, they were putting a lot of pressure on Qasim to play a bigger role in government. And here, let's go back to your initial question, Daniel, because it helps us understand the context to that pressure. We have the crisis that's happening around the nationalists. And that crisis means that a lot of people within the army and elsewhere are disgruntled with Qasim. And you have also the UAR being disgruntled with him, because of the fact that he's seen as taking an anti-UAR policy. He's seen as objecting to the union. He's seen as allowing for attacks on Nasser himself even. And he's seen also as being very close to a communist base that Nasser is trying to tame within his own territories. So it's a very complicated story, but it ends up creating tensions. Here, the localized arena where these tensions actually unfold, unfortunately, was already tense. And initially, it's Mosul. That's the biggest initial local test for Abdul-Karim Qasim and for everybody else in Iraq. You have this attempt on the part of UAR-backed officers, as well as tribal figures, representing the leadership of Shammar, which is a huge, massive tribal confederation that, by the way, includes tribes in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, Iraq, and to a lesser extent, Jordan. Shammar is a huge tribal confederation. In a way, it's a transnational force. And one of their figures is very important in the Mosul region, Ahmed al-Yawar. And now they're connected to a region in the easternmost part of Syria that is almost contiguous with Iraq. The boundary doesn't even make sense there. Later on, by the way, that becomes a region that has attracted a lot of news during the Arab Spring period because of the presence of ISIS there. It's this area that is open, almost an open boundary. It is historically joined the two countries together. Mosul was always the closest part of Iraq to Syria in that way, as a major city. And Mosul's historic relationship is with Aleppo, of course, but it's also with the Jazeera region in Syria, which has a large Shammari base. So you have the Shammar Tribal Confederation playing a role in the events in Mosul. They're opposed to the policies of Qasim. There's this promised UAR backing for a coup that they would launch from Mosul. In Mosul itself, you have a set of contradictions that also facilitate this problem. Mosul is not a stronghold for the communists. It is a predominantly Arab Sunni city. Its countryside is mixed, but it's bordering many Kurdish areas. So also It has a complicated historical relationship with Kurdistan, Iraq. Also, it's surrounded by minorities like Yazidis, Assyrians, and of course Kurds that have a tense relationship with the central authority and the cities that represented central authority historically. In this case, Mosul, even in Ottoman times, that's where the central authority tended to be concentrated.
And those minorities from the rural areas around Mosul tend to be aligned with Qasim and help put down the rebellion, but in a pretty messy way.
Some of them are aligned with Qasim, and some of them are aligned with him temporarily for their own interests and purposes. Some of them have for example, anti-Arab nationalist agenda. You know, in the case of some of the Kurdish sections, some of the Kurdish sections have a communist agenda. Some have different sort of agendas. You have scores that are being settled between, for example, Assyrians and Mosulite Arabs. It's a very complicated, very ethnically mixed region. You have also class dynamics going on. You have clashes between different tribal confederations, Arab Sunni tribal confederations happening there. And again, what happens in a situation of major upheaval and social change and political change, such as the one that was unleashed by the 1958 revolution, is that somehow you get class, ethnic, and sectarian cleavages as well as ideological ones, all playing out at the same time. That's why it's so difficult to describe everything that goes on. But then they coalesce around individual figures. In this case, the individual figures that they coalesce around are principally, the main individual figure is Abdul-Karim Qasim and what he represents. But then against him, there's a big coalition developing. And that coalition includes Arab nationalists who don't like his policy towards the UAR. It includes people from landowning classes that don't like his recent announcements around the peasantry and its role. They were likely to lose a lot of land. The sheikhs of Shammar, they own huge territories, and that they're big landowners in that part of Iraq. If Qasim were to carry out this program, they were going to lose thousands of acres. So there's all these complicated factors.
And similarly in Kirkuk, you have this same sort of complex overlapping of sectarian political class conflicts erupting in a very messy and kind of overdetermined manner. And what the result there is communist-aligned Kurds committing atrocities against Turkmen in the city.
Right.
And it's a national scandal.
And that, of course, happens right after you had the massacres taking place in Mosul earlier. So you have in Mosul this attempted coup, which is referred to as the Shawaf coup of 1959, in reference to an army officer that basically was seen as heading the movement. He wasn't really heading it, but he was part of it, and it gets reference to him. The coup is badly organized, and pro-Qasim forces are able to suppress it. But what's very consequential in Mosul is that it pits the communists against the nationalists. The communists commit atrocities against nationalists there. They don't have a base in that city, but they actually enter the city. And they organize like a big, once they start sensing that there's a coup being prepared against Qasim in that city, they organize a big like peace day, celebration, and they use it as an excuse to bring in people up to, a couple of 100,000 people, maybe 250,000 people. We don't know the exact numbers, but come in from outside of Mosul. They go there, and they include people also coming in from Kurdistan that are Kurdish nationalists under Barzani's direction. They go in. There are all these forces coming in, and they're there to protect Qasim, but each for their own reasons. And they end up killing dozens of people in the process. Now, once you do that, and once you have, subsequent events, which is a complete crackdown on the Ba'ath, on the part of Communist Party affiliated organs, which is exactly what happens after the coup, the 59 attempted coup, then you will have scores that will to be settled for generations ahead. We cannot actually detach this from what happens later on. People wonder why is Saddam so bloody, for example. In the West, they just pathologize these leaders. And of course, I'm not saying that Saddam is a good guy. He was a very brutal character. But there's a background to the Ba'ath clash with the communists that goes back to this phase. This phase plays a key role because before that, all of these parties were contesting with the authority. They were not necessarily clashing with each other in this bloody way. They competed over recruiting cadres. They had ideological disagreements. But that's one thing. And actually having an armed military clash. And, each party will have its own version. The communists will tell you we're protecting the government from a reactionary takeover, and the Baathists will tell you we were fighting for the cause of Arab unity. But at the end of the day, the fact that you had this entry of communist-affiliated forces and other, of course, social forces in the country into this city, the deaths that ensued creates a bloody atmosphere. And later on, the Ba'ath reproduces this bloody atmosphere in very significant ways. They commit serious atrocities against the communists in turn. And it becomes a serious long-term cycle of almost a political vendetta emerges out of this between the Ba'ath and the communists. It also has regional implications. The Ba'ath and communist relations really suffer regionally as a byproduct of what takes place in 1959, which was not good, by the way, for the anti-imperialist future in the region as a whole. So following the Mosul events, you have the ascendancy of the communists, and they start gaining they feel that they have the upper hand in a way. And they feel that they're in a position to even pressure Abdul-Karim Qasim himself by demanding a greater role in government. One of the good byproducts of that is that we end up with the first woman minister in the Arab world, Naziha Dulaimi. Basically, she comes from the feminist movement. She comes from the Iraqi women's movement. She helps produce a very progressive policy that would challenge long-standing discriminatory policies against women in Iraq. As a minister, she really does push a women's agenda. So you have progressive policies that are driven by the communists and by their representatives that are very important in this period. And at the same time, however, you have Qasim being increasingly resentful at the fact that he's so dependent on the communists, and he tries to again crack down on them at different moments. One of the moments that matter to him the most and that lead to that is this moment in Kirkuk, where in Kirkuk we have a clash that is happening, that a local nature, almost an ethnic local tension, along with again there were class dynamics to it, other dynamics going on, but it's essentially a Turkmen town, as we mentioned earlier, that has increasingly attracted Kurdish migration and has changed, therefore, its ethnic character over the years. Now, there's this big tension that takes place in Kirkuk of a local nature that leads to massacres against the Turkmens there. But the big problem for the communists is that many of the Kurdish perpetrators of that massacre actually belong to the Communist Party or claim to be part of the Communist Party. So now most people will tell you these were not really communists. They were, and the Communist Party itself actually then did an autocritique around that, but however, what cannot be discounted is that the communists were seen as participating in a massacre against the minority there. And it was a serious massacre. It led to many Turkmens fleeing their historic city, a city that they had lived in for centuries and in which they were the predominant social group in. That really tarnished the reputation of the party. It also led to a major crackdown on the part of Qasim in the long run. He felt he needed to control the growth of communist power. And he had a very difficult set of challenges because he needs a communist, but he doesn't want to be dependent on them. And he doesn't want to alienate the nationalists too much, but he doesn't want to certainly allow for their program to take hold. He's engaged now in an open confrontation with Nasser. After Mosul events, the Nasser's radio stations are directed at him. They're critiquing him openly. He's being attacked. He undertakes a set of moves to try to counterbalance that, partly by actually offering himself as a bigger anti-imperialist than Nasser himself. So, for example, the first Arab regime to officially adopt the idea of training Palestinian officers is that of Abdul-Karim Qasim. He starts the initial nucleus out of which eventually the Palestine Liberation Army, once the PLO is founded, they get, the initial Palestinian officers are trained by him. He says, we're gonna, train Palestinians to liberate Palestine. That's one example. Another move that he tries to do is to say, Kuwait is part of Iraq historically. I don't accept the British attempt to detach it from Iraq. And that, of course, leads to a major clash again with Nasser, because Nasser supports then Kuwait as an independent country. And that, of course, becomes a major dynamic that gets replayed later on when Saddam Hussein, invades Kuwait.
3 decades later.
3 decades later. But in this period, Qasim makes the initial claim on Kuwait in the context, of course, where it was clear that the British were going to have to leave Kuwait. And they were leaving Kuwait because of the rise of a strong independence movement there. We've described some elements of it. The movement of Arab nationalists plays a big role there. So there's a strong independence current led by that movement on the popular level, but also it coincides with the will of the local emir, Abdullah Salim, who had an agenda that sought an independent Kuwaiti independence. So at the same time, you have the British departure, opens a possibility for Qasim to make a bid on Kuwait, and he does that. So he's presenting himself as a figure of Arab unity of a different kind. He's reclaiming what he saw as lost Iraqi territory. He started this notion that, well, Kuwait always followed the governor of Basra under Ottoman times, therefore Iraq has a claim on it. It's only because of the British establishing it as a separate entity that it was now separating. That was the line that he was taking. Now, of course, that was ignoring the fact that, that might have been popular in Kuwait in the 1930s, that kind of line. During the days of King Ghazi in Iraq, actually, there was a movement on the part of Kuwaiti merchants demanding union with Iraq. But by the time we get to the 1960s, after Kuwait became such a huge oil producer, the class interests in Kuwait are no longer there to support an idea of union with Iraq, because it's a very tiny population that is sitting on a sea of oil. So financially, it's much better off being an independent, small, almost city-state, because all of that oil goes to a population numbering a very small number compared to that of Iraq. So the economic realities create a different kind of orientation. Even though Kuwait, of course, is officially adopting an Arab nationalist line at this stage, but it does not want to fall under Iraqi control.
Did this rivalry between Qasim and Nasser also play out on the economic front? The historian Cyrus Shaeg has described a sort of policy arms race between Qasim's Iraq and the UAR, each racing to implement successively more egalitarian policies around land reform, the elevation of living standards, nationalizations. Is that how you would describe it?
No, I wouldn't describe it in those terms. I think that they were corresponding to national developments within these countries and class pressures within these countries and ideological developments within these countries. Now, I wouldn't say that there was no interest in each of these figures presenting themselves as a greater champion of the people. But look, let me put it this way, Daniel. There is the type of history I do connects social structures and class dynamics and social movements to political developments, and all the while situating it within the geopolitical map. But it takes seriously what people were trying to do at the time. Qasim had a set of social pressures on him to enact reforms, but he also had a vision of reform that corresponded to his outlook. And he fit in within a longer history of class struggle within the country in which he was operating. He ended up taking, by the way, a middle path. He did not go too radical, but he undertook some serious radical steps, such as the nationalization of the oil company. But he would have wanted to make that move, whether Nasser had existed or not. Same with Nasser. I mean, the idea of nationalization, the idea of turning towards socialism, that had to do with pressures locally, but also with broader readings of the map. It had to do also with the relations with the Soviet Union. It had to do with all sorts of factors, with prevalent ways of looking at the economy at the time. Both were trying to answer a similar question, which is how to create development in the context of a Cold War, in the context of the Cold War. And in a way, both arrived at a version of almost a social democratic formula. They did not go down the fully communist path, but they did try to improve the lot of the working and peasant classes.
And was this Arab socialist developmentalist model, was it successful in terms of improving living standards, boosting health, education, things of that sort?
There's no question that you had an expansion of working class education in this period. You had greater access to health. You had numerous gains that were made by the working classes in these countries in this period. You also had a situation where a certain sort of national bourgeoisie also benefited. Both Egypt and Iraq were economically growing. In the case of Egypt, it was making enormous growth until the 1967 war, and that was benefiting a certain type of national bourgeoisie. Of course, you had large monopolies and large companies being nationalized and broken up, and that leads to major conflicts with national capital. But there's no project on the part of Nasser to completely alienate national capital, and the same is the case for Qasim. In fact, during Qasim's years, many of the big capitalists and industrialists celebrate them as golden years for them. It was a golden age for them because, yes, he raised taxation, but he gave many privileges for industrialists, and he gave them loans from the central bank, and so it's a complicated picture. Now, Shaykh is saying, however, I would say that there is a relevant bit in it, which is that both would want to boast about their achievements in this regard. So in a generally progressive atmosphere where progressive ideologies were on the rise, the idea of boasting about achievements, including nationalization and including greater programs that benefit the working class and the peasantry and land reform and so on, was not something you'd want to hide in your general publicity. But is it part of some sort of competition with Nasser? I don't think so.
We keep mentioning that in 1961, Qasim made Iraq the first Arab country to unilaterally impose new contract terms on the oil majors. But we haven't really talked about OPEC yet, which was founded in 1960, and Iraq was one of 5 founding members alongside Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. What role was oil playing in Iraq and also in Qasim's Iraq and also in this larger wave of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial Arab nationalism that we've spent this entire series discussing? And then somewhat at odds with this sort of anti-imperialist solidarity, how were increasing oil revenues changing Arab countries and also the relationship between those Arab countries, given that different Arab countries had very different oil resources under their soil? And this will become profoundly consequential in the decades that follow as well.
Daniel, it's important to remember here that there was major imperialist interest in propping up monarchical regimes in the Arab oil-producing region in the Arab East, and in those countries that did possess oil resources. So in general, the Western powers favored dealing with individual rulers that have a connection to them, that were conservative, that were tried and tested. That's why they invested heavily in supporting such governments. In Iraq, that was certainly the case. But Iraq had a different sociological makeup than to that prevailing in the other oil-producing countries in the Mashriq. Because Iraq, first of all, had a greater urban, presence. It had cities and urban life, and places like the Gulf had urban life, but it was much smaller scale historically. And by the way, I don't want to contribute here to this false notion that has anything to do with one place being better than the other. In fact, much of my scholarship is used to combat that. I always emphasize the fact that you had the dynamic political movements in the Gulf, and I've written on a revolutionary movement there.
And we'll discuss that in some depth, and I think in the episode after next.
And I mentioned this because there's now also great sensitivity in the Arabian Peninsula around this notion that sometimes gets propagated that they were just a bunch of Bedouins that were not civilized, and somehow older centers of civilization in the region that are more advanced are like Iraq and Egypt and so on. There's a stock that is stereotyping and hurtful to people that comes out of these. But it's important to separate, a sociological discussion from these kind of narrow-minded, discriminatory outlooks and stereotyping that goes on. There is no city like Baghdad or Basra or Mosul in the Gulf at this stage, and not even in Saudi Arabia. You do have, however, of course, in the western part of Saudi Arabia, you have in Hijaz, an urban life that is connected to the Hajj. You have in different parts of the Gulf Coast trading and transit ports and so on that are basically centered around merchant classes. So they have their own dynamics. But the complexity that you have in Iraq in terms of the fact that you have a very big urban life, you have a very rich countryside with thousands of villages, you have a much larger population. It means that the ability for an imperial power to control it is much more complex and much more difficult. The challenge is much more difficult than, let's say, controlling a small space, like the crucial Oman coast, for example, which is the current United Arab Emirates. Much smaller population, much smaller territory, or even smaller places like Bahrain or Kuwait. They all have their own complexities and social dynamics, but Iraq is a very complicated space. Nevertheless, in Iraq, as in elsewhere, they invest in monarchical rule. Now, that investment fails, and that poses a threat to the rest of the region. They're worried about the fall of the monarchical model in the other oil-producing areas. They were already worried about it after the fall of the monarchy in Egypt, and after the changes that happened post-Baghdad Pact, post the aggression on Suez, on Egypt, and post all of these dynamics they had with Nasser. Oil becomes a key question. Part of the reason why they're fearing Nasser is that this figure is spreading revolutionary ferment. Without Nasser, the revolution in Iraq might have not happened. He provided an example for these officers. The developments that took place and the clashes that took place around the Baghdad Pact were driven by him. You had the tripartite aggression producing ferment in Iraq and elsewhere. So these things have their own life, take their own life and shape. Revolutionary processes are influenced in this region by a major change, like the change that was brought about by the rise of Nasser. So there's this worry that Egypt is a revolutionary export center that is affecting a region that is rich in oil.
Right, because even though Egypt doesn't have a lot of oil, for example, under King Saud, and we'll get into this more in a couple episodes, you have a petroleum minister, Abdul Takriti, who is Nasserist and known as the Red Sheikh because he is a leading founder of OPEC and trying to mobilize the whole oil-producing Arab world and the whole oil-producing colonial world, post-colonial world, to take control of their oil resources.
Absolutely. And here also we should think about it across also the ethnic divides existing in this region. If you look at the Middle East, the first major nationalization does not take place actually in Egypt. It takes place in Iran with Mossadegh. And here which of course gives Nasser, perspective on what he needs to do with Suez and how he needs to deal. When people talk about Nasser's fears and paranoia around political parties and so on, I should remind you that he's not entirely wrong to say the imperialists are out there to plot against him or others. If you're going to nationalize, if you're going to make bold moves against them, they will seize the opportunity and they will use local forces. That's what happened to Mossadegh. So that informs a certain way of thinking around the questions of nationalization. And it starts with the nationalization of oil under Mossadegh. That leads to a coup carried out against him. We've discussed this in the Iran episodes, but in the dig, and I think people should listen to that discussion. But that had its repercussions. And the biggest imperialist fear is, what if this was to become the main phenomena everywhere in the Middle East? Can you imagine? It would be a disaster for them. Now, later on, of course, governments in the region that are allied to the British and the Americans do end up taking control over their oil companies, but that takes place on terms that are amenable to the West and that do not entail a clash with the West. These are regimes that are allied to them.
Like the Shah.
Like the Shah and like the Saudis. The Saudis now own Aramco. But when it comes to oil policy, they will consult with the United States. They will have Western influence. And if there is a clash like the one that took place in 1973, it's a temporary clash. And in a way, it's not necessarily entirely out of line with the overall interests of oil companies. American oil companies benefited from the rise in prices. Maybe not the consumers, but it's a complicated phenomenon. That was almost a corrective move for them, price-wise. So these are issues to think about when we're discussing the political economy of this period and the connection between geopolitical orientation and political and economic orientation.
On that note, Batatu's story, which again, I mean, this is a remarkable, very complex, very long book. His history is ultimately not just about colonialism and anti-colonial rebellion, but really fundamentally about the rise of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, all of the social and economic upheavals that result from colonialism inserting Iraq into the world capitalist market. And so Batatu's story is really about the history of class conflict in Iraq, a conflict that also plays out through all the geographic, religious, ethnic modalities in which class is lived in Iraq. What sort of analysis is this? How does it make sense of everything from why the July Revolution happened to the social background of communist and Ba'athist leaders, to what he argues is the ultimate post-revolutionary political triumph of the middle classes? What's Batatu's method in making sense of Iraqi history, and how would you summarize his ultimate conclusions?
Well, I mean, I think that Batatu's method relies on accounting for class, as you mentioned, without discounting other factors. And again, he looks at the intersection between questions of class, questions of sect in a country that has multiple religions operating, in a country that has a rich also ethnic diversity to it, in a country that has all sorts of other dynamics going on, but also that was connected to a world that goes beyond the Middle East. It's a country that is connected to the decisions of the great powers, and later on the decisions of the superpowers. And of course, we see this to the current phase, even long after Batatu dies. We have a situation where Iraq was reshaped by foreign imperial invasion by the United States. Now, it was done under the guise of combating dictatorship or whatever, but of course, in reality, nobody believes that was the case, because look at the situation prevailing there. It instituted a regime that in many ways is much, much worse than anything that had preceded it, because it destroyed the local state. So I think Batatu is very cognizant of the international factors that were affecting Iraq, as well as the local class dynamics. This is something that sets him apart from some historians that overemphasize one over the other, or that overemphasize, or even worse, that overemphasize sect, for example. During the invasion of Iraq, there was suddenly this fashion in the Middle East studies to turn everything into sect, or to turn the whole discussion into terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism, or you have this incredibly simplistic analysis, but also analysis that ultimately serves imperialist agendas in the region, because it says, oh, look, these people are backwards, they're driven by fanaticism, they have nothing else going on in their social reality, and essentially by doing that you justify their domination and control. And that's always been the Orientalist game. So one thing that Batatu did in Middle East studies, and I'm going to here frame it as his contribution, I would say, to Middle East studies, was to actually remind people that, look, this is a real society. It has its own real internal dynamics and their class dynamics. He introduced the study of class in a major way to this part of the world. Of course, there were others that had class analysis, of that generation. You had great people like Anwar Abdel Malik and others. These were all people that were either communists or influenced by Marxist analysis. Like, I would say that Batatu is a Marxian for sure, but people like Anwar Abdel Malik, of course, were card-carrying members of the Egyptian Communist Party, so they were Marxists. But people like that, they definitely emphasize class, but they did not discount the other factors that were operating in a complex place like Iraq.
We should maybe close just by noting on this afternoon in Rhode Island, late evening in Amman, Jordan, where you are, that Israel appears to be beginning its invasion of Rafah, where believe the majority of residents of Gaza have now been pushed by the ongoing genocide being carried out with U.S. support there. We should note at this moment that Batatu was a Palestinian. How did that identity and that life experience shape his analysis and his great works on Iraq and Syria?
Yeah, Batatu was born in Jerusalem. He is very much a product of that Nakba generation that we talked about. He was born in 1926. So when he left Palestine, he was 22 years old. And he left during the Nakba in 1948. He was one of those Palestinians that lost a homeland and that witnessed the horrors of the Nakba. I don't think that it's possible to detach that reality from the way he thought and the way he viewed the world around him. He did not write on Palestine, but of course, that did not come out of a lack of interest in it. It probably came out of pain. But also, like many Palestinians of his generation and even later on other Palestinians always had an interest in understanding the region around them. And there is this phenomena, a Palestinian historical scholarship on the Arab region, progressive Palestinian historical scholarship. I myself wrote my first major work on Oman and on a revolutionary movement in Oman, the last secular revolution to have occurred in the Arab East that took place there. So this general commitment to progressive scholarship was very important for Palestinians, and I think in many ways Hanna Batatu led the way.
That was the 10th episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Thanks for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Fiorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at The Dig Radio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or another such platform, please also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly does that is you telling your friends to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.